Anything else today? This meeting is being recorded, so I've been told. And I need to click on continue. Yes. Okay. And so, yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for this opportunity to share my study with you. It's been a really interesting journey since the beginning of this year when I joined the team. And so today I'm presenting my thesis. I'll try to cover as much of the background as possible so the presentation will make better sense. And I want to showcase the methodology a little bit. So hopefully people have something that they find useful at the end of this presentation. So, and I also have a couple of interactive activities, so feel free to join in on the analysis. Okay, so I'll share my screen with you now. So you should be able to see the presentation slide now. Yeah, okay. Okay, so my thesis title is A Critical Discourse Study of Taiwan's Indigenous Language Revitalization. And today's presentation, I'm gonna just give you a sort of a general background about my study, and I'll get into a little bit more details about the methodology. And in the methodological section, I will have a little interactive activities for us. I'll present not all of the findings, but 2 to 3 discourse, see how much time we have to cover that. And I'll have a short conclusion. So before I started my PhD, obviously there's a few questions I asked myself, why do I want to do a study about indigenous language revitalization? Why do we save languages? And obviously there are some obvious debates. Whether they are strong enough for the individuals, I think, we'll have to judge for ourselves. So one of the earlier argument is based on a moral condition, that saving language is the right thing to do. And often these arguments are based on, the comparison between linguistic diversity and biodiversity. But there are people that oppose these ideas, saying that linguistic diversity, you can't compare that with biodiversity. So a stronger moral argument would be the use of linguistic human rights. It is to say that using using someone's first language is their basic rights. So therefore, to remove their rights is to violate their human right. But the moral conditions sometimes don't really sit in well with some other arguments. So we need a stronger persuasion. And the second stronger argument is to look at language as a public good. So this is the economical approach, the economics of language. So if we look at language as a public good, we can see that language contains a lot of environmental knowledge about the land, about the plants, about the animals. So to lose the language is to lose all that knowledge. It contains historical knowledge because the language lived the history. And also, to have all these different languages, it helps the study of human cognition. So David Crystal famously quoted this quote here: each language constitutes a certain model of the universe, a semiotic system of understanding of the world. And if we have 4,000 different ways to describe the world, This makes us rich. So it is quite daunting to think that we might end up with just a handful of super language. Like, imagine if we just end up with Chinese, English, and French, possibly Russian. Then our world, the way we see our world will be severely handicapped, according to Crystal. But, with the will to save the languages, can threatened languages be saved? Yes and no. In order to save these languages, we have to find out why this language disappears. Okay, so we are looking at language attrition. And language attrition, there's 4 different ways that a language disappears. The first one is called sudden attrition. This, as the name suggests, sudden attrition means the language loss is sudden. So this could be, for example, genocide. And radical attrition means the speakers consciously distance themselves from the language they speak. This could be, caused by political reasons, etc. And gradual attrition means the speakers suffer from a language shift, which means they start to speak a preferred language, as it is the case for a lot of indigenous language speakers. And the fourth attrition is called the bottom-up attrition, which means the language is already stopped being used at home, but it's being used in a lot of ceremonial situations. And because of the domain that it's used, it's perceived as prestigious. So it's really hard so the speakers will tell you that their language is not disappearing, but it is. So so this gets a bit tricky because the language is then self-perceived as still in use, but in reality it's not. So this is just one of the measurements we have to first find out why the language disappear. And then we have to find out how endangered these languages are. And we have scales to measure that. And one of the most famous scale is called the intergenerational transmission scale. So as the name suggests, language needs to be used intergenerationally. So at any point, those intergenerational transmission of a language is interrupted, it will show on the scales, and that shows you how endangered a language is. And we also need to find out how the language users feel about their languages. And that's what we call language ideology. So we'll talk a little bit more about language ideology later because it is related to ideology, even though the definition seems descriptive, how people feel about their language. It is actually ideological, and it is very, obviously socially constructed. And often the speakers of a language will face sort of ideological complexes about their language. And this involves a private ideology versus public ideology. So for example, privately, they might think their language is very important, but publicly, they might refuse to speak their language because of social stigma. Also, language speakers will face a purist ideology versus a modernized ideology, where some speakers might think that, they have to use their language in a certain way. Whereas as the time has moved on, other speakers of that language will probably think that we need to modernize our language. Otherwise, there is no place for a language in the modern world. So these two ideologies often will in conflict within a speaker community. Also, the third ideological complex is an essentialist versus indexical ideology over a language. So the essentialist language ideology means that the language is your identity, whereas indexical orientation means the language is only part of the identity. So this then sort of Sorry, my dog is barking. So this then obviously will affect how a speaker views the language and therefore the major need for language revitalization. So now we know how a language slowly disappears, but how can language policy help with the situation? In this study, we don't view language policy just as words. We view them as discourse. And discourse are mechanisms that we use to create reality. So we're trying to use the language policies to recreate a reality where this language will actually work. Whereas the current reality is that, you know, the current policies doesn't allow these languages to thrive. The earliest language policy study that shows a critical understanding of how language policy creates reality is Rees. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly. Rees's policy orientation theory. So in this theory, he says, you know, language policy can create reality about language by first viewing language as a problem. That's the early orientation of policy in the 60s, 50s, when countries have language policies that views other languages as problems. So for example, the early immigration policy where everybody has to speak English, or, you know, colonization where indigenous languages are viewed as a problem. But as time has moved on, many policies now view these other languages as resource, which is a step forward. But what we really want is to view the languages as rights for the people. Is their given right to speak their language. So that's where we want to get to. So far, up to here, this provides a general background of the thesis. And in the second half, I want to kind of just get into the more specific information about Taiwan's political situation and the details of the study, including data and analysis and findings. So putting Taiwan in perspective, I don't know if you all know where Taiwan is. It's a little island next to China. And in this map, I managed to find Taiwan and New Zealand both on the map, because sometimes Taiwan and New Zealand both are not on the map, interestingly. And Taiwan is roughly 5 times smaller than New Zealand, but has 5 times more population than New Zealand. And Taiwan has 16 different indigenous languages, and they are not Chinese languages. So in Taiwan, we have the indigenous language, and we also have the branches of Chinese languages that has the roots in the Chinese languages. So the indigenous languages are the indigenous people in Taiwan. We have about 2% of the population that are indigenous. And their languages are termed Formosan languages, and they are most diverse within the entire Austronesian language family. So the Austronesian language family actually covers the South Pacific as well. So Te Reo Maori is part of the Austronesian language family. And there are 16 officially recognized indigenous nationalities. Well, sometimes we call them nationalities because that's the term First Nation we use. And sometimes we will call them tribes. So those two terms are interchangeable. And these languages are mutually unintelligible. So they are they belong to the same language family, but they can't really communicate with each other using their language. They're quite different. And because of the diversity of language, Taiwan's indigenous languages are thought to be the origin of those Austronesian languages. And these languages are definitely endangered. So here I prepared a map of the distribution of indigenous people. This is a bit of an old map, and I couldn't quite find the most up-to-date map and which says something really. So in this map, there's not 16, there's only 12 indigenous groups. And the distribution is not proportionate with the population. This just a distribution sort of indicates their traditional territory. And here, this picture is where I was when I went for my field work. So I did a few interviews here in this village called Wu Tai. And I stayed down there where the houses are. And I took a morning walk up the hill so I can take this photo. So Wu Tai is, if you go back to this picture here at the bottom there is a tribe called Taiwan. So Taiwan, and at the top there is Rukai. So Wutai is where the Rukai people is. So as you can see in this map of Taiwan, there is that blue star at the top there, and that's where my home is. And so I felt personally sort of this, I feel this subject is quite close to me because also I live here. So I felt, have a personal connection to this research. So what are the languages in Taiwan? Like I said, we have the Chinese language families and the Austronesian indigenous language families. And the language population is closely linked to the colonization history of Taiwan. So as you can see at the top of the language population on the left, we have Haklau and Holo. Those two languages are part of the Chinese language family. But you might be surprised to see that they are not Mandarin Chinese. So they are a kind of coastal dialect from the coast of mainland China when people moved to Taiwan in the 14th century. And a brief history of colonization adding to this picture is that in the 16th century, Taiwan was also colonized by Dutch and Spanish. But Dutch and Spanish had other missions in Taiwan, mostly to do with trades and missionaries. So they didn't really influence the language population in Taiwan. Taiwan was also briefly colonized by Japan up to the Second World War. Many people speak Japanese, but Japanese is not really fully established as a local language. It was for necessity because Japan had a monolingual policy on Taiwan. So during that 50 years, people had to learn Japanese. And what I want to focus on is the Mandarin Chinese speakers here. You can see there's 13% Mandarin Chinese speakers. 13% isn't a lot, but how come Mandarin is not the dominant language? It's because in 1949, the current the Republic of China government moved to Taiwan and use Mandarin Chinese. So people moved to Taiwan and they speak all different dialects from China. So they needed a sort of a unified language. So Mandarin Chinese was made a unified language. And because it comes with the military power, So the 13% Mandarin Chinese language speakers are seen as the dominant language speakers, even though there's only 13%. And then left just the 2% of the indigenous people there and their language, which caused further attrition of the language. And here is a quick list of the political power change in Taiwan. So on the left, you can see the period where the time period, and on the right we have the political party. So in 1949, when the Chinese Nationalist Party moved to Taiwan, they had one president, Chiang Kai-shek, for many, many years, and Taiwan was under martial law. So as you can see, up to the year 2000, the political power finally changed. And why does it take so long? Taiwan is supposed to be democratic, but it's not entirely true. Taiwan actually had its first democratically elected president in 1996. Surprise. And so since then, the power has changed a few times. So DPP is the party that's pro-Taiwan's independence, and KMT is the one that moved to Taiwan from China, and so that's called the Chinese Nationalist Party. And the Chinese Nationalist Party, when they moved to Taiwan, like the Japanese, they had a monolingual policy, so Mandarin Chinese only. And that has caused quite a lot of problem. And since 1996, given that the global trend had put quite a lot of focus on people's linguistic human rights, Taiwan has also harped on that bandwagon. And then in 1996, they established the Council of Indigenous Peoples. They changed the name of Indigenous Peoples to Indigenous Peoples, whereas previously they called them the Mountain People. And we established the Education Act for Indigenous people. We start having laws and plans, but these have all been criticized for being a political tool, for lack of fundings, for the lack of resource, etc., etc. And on the left here, as you can see, in 2008, there is the first wave of indigenous language revitalization plans, 6-year plans for indigenous language revitalization. But out of all of these policies and criticisms, I'm finding the results quite unconvincing. So therefore, I have proposed a different way of looking at this social issue. And in critical discourse term, we call them social wrong. So I propose to use critical discourse studies. Critical discourse studies was initially called critical discourse analysis. Before it was called critical discourse analysis, it was actually called critical linguistics. So linguistic component is quite an important component for critical discourse studies. And being critical is to be aware of the power abuse, power imbalance, dominance, and inequality. And discourse is, written or spoken text, so to speak. And the study is the analysis part. However, the reason that people decide that it's not called critical discourse analysis anymore, because being critical, it's not simply an analysis. It's an attitude to problem solve. Therefore, it is now preferred. Critical discourse study is now the preferred term that we will use. And to simply say critical discourse studies is to apply critical theory to discourse studies, it's too simple. So critical discourse studies really is the integration of social theories with discourse theories that involves linguistic analysis. So it is always transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary. in that sense. And for the design of this study, as you can see on the left is kind of the process of analysis where we have the framework, that's critical discourse studies, and we look into the ideology and we're trying to find out what effects these have on the subject. And the data of the study includes policy documents and indigenous participants. And as the arrow suggests, we're looking at the policy ideology, we're looking at the participants' ideology, and we're also looking at how the policy and the participants interact. And for the remaining of the presentation, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the methodology and method. And we'll have some little analysis together if we have time. So the methodological approach is critical discourse studies. It is not a methodology, neither is it a method. It's actually a field of study. Some key features of critical discourse studies are that it explores the relationship between power, ideology, and discourse. It contains a systematic linguistic analysis of text. It takes into account the broader social, political, and historical context, and it focuses on interdisciplinary research. And it has an emancipatory aim. So we're trying to make things better. The analytical framework I have chosen here is Fairclough's three-dimensional discourse theory. And the three circles you see here, I must emphasize that it is not a concentric circle. So it's not one circle within a bigger circle. It's a three-dimensional picture. So you have to imagine these three circles, they're actually the same size and they lay on top of each other. So how do we apply this three-dimensional discourse to my study? As you can see in the middle, we have text. We have to describe the text. So in this study, the text is the policy and the interview. And the second dimension is the discursive practice, which we have to interpret how discourse and people interact. And the third dimension is the social practice, which is the social historical context. So let's have a look how this is applied to this study. So we can see the text as the first dimension is obtained from policies and interviews. And in this dimension, we explain why it is. We don't analyze it. When you get to the second dimension, we now need to focus on the production, distribution, and consumption of this text. And the discourse practice can be analyzed in various ways. This is where the analysis takes place. And we can look at, how social agents are positioned. We can look at modality. We can look at word choice, etc., etc. And the final layer of a three-dimensional discourse analysis then is to take into account the historical context, the norms, the ideology in which the social agents draw upon to create, interpret, and disseminate and recontextualize language policies. So lots of words here that you may not fully understand. So I am going to just quickly give you a rundown of some key terminologies for critical discourse studies. So discourse and power. Discourse is a relatively stable use of language serving the organizational structure of life. That just basically means we use discourse to sustain the ideology within a structure. I'll give you an example later. Also, we look at discourse as action, performance, and beings. So it basically says we use discourse to do stuff. We use these words to make people do things. and therefore to sustain power. So here is an example from Bordeaux, and here is an example of power of suggestion. So suggestions is a type of discourse. It is a way of using language to sustain power. So I'll read out this quote. Instead of telling the child what he must do, tell him what he is, and thus leads him to become durably what he has to be in the condition for the effectiveness of all kinds of symbolic power that will subsequently be able to operate on a habitus predisposed to respond to them. So if we apply this logic to language policy, we are seeing that policy often positions indigenous people as incapable of doing anything for themselves, which then leads the indigenous people to rely on the government to basically in this way, this kind of construction kind of takes away the power of a person. So this is an example of how discourse sustain power. And ideology is another key concept for a critical discourse study. Ideology is often viewed as false consciousness and domination. And when it's incorporated or inculcated in your everyday life as a common sense, it's viewed as hegemony. And therefore, ideology always get given sort of a bad name. Ideology is also a worldview, and a person's worldview is a very carefully crafted ideas a person have about the world. So it's not exactly descriptive. It's very much influenced by a lot of things. And another key term of this study is language ideology. So language ideology is the attitude people have towards a language. It seems descriptive, but bear in mind that these ideas and attitude are politically loaded ideas about languages. So language ideology is as political as the ideology itself. And another key terminology for this study is intertextuality and recontextualization. Really long words. But long words short, it just means when you produce text continuously through different forms, the meaning will eventually change. So recontextualization just means the same thing, but will be reinterpreted differently in a different situation. And why is that important for this study? Because we can see the policy have changed over time, but what does that mean for indigenous language revitalization? That also have changed over time to suit different political agenda. And for this study, I have collected two sets of data. The first set of data is the policy documents. And I collect these two particular policies because one, they are to do specifically with indigenous language revitalization. Two, they mark milestones of social change in Taiwan. So the first set of policies are the 6-year plan for indigenous language revitalizations. There's two stages, stage 1 and stage 2. So there's two plans. And bear in mind that the two different plans are released by two different government powers. So one is from the Democratic Chinese Nationalist Party, and one is from the pro-Taiwan Independence Party. And because of the history of colonization, these two parties have very different agenda to do with indigenous language. We'll see a little bit of that in the analysis. I also interviewed 11 indigenous participants. The recruitment method is snowball sampling. And one key thing that I didn't do is that I didn't make any initial contact with the participants. They contacted me, so I went through a third person because I was quite aware of the coercive power of sort of the non-indigenous people doing indigenous studies. So I wanted them to approach me. I didn't want them to feel that they have to in any ways, because I came from the Mandarin Chinese speaking family background. So historically that's got a bit of coercive power there. And once I've collected data, in my analysis, there are some categories that I look into. And with these categories, I then apply the linguistic analysis to them. So the analytical tools we have here are lexical grammar, so word choice and grammatical structures, semantic tools, words that makes meanings, and another linguistic strategies is called legitimization strategies, which is the strategies that we use to persuade people to do things for us. So the first analytical tools for the policy document is called the construction of purpose. This is a grammatical structure that we use to construct purpose. And because policy signifies the government's ideology, and therefore the purpose in the policy, I would say, is the intention of the government, and therefore the government's ideology. So the grammatical structure of this goes like this. Do X in order to achieve Y. Do X is the action, so number one, purposeful action. In order to is the purposeful link. And to achieve Y is the purposeful statement. So that's the purpose, is to achieve Y. So here is a little exercise that you can do. The children borrowed some laptops so they can do their work at home. What's the purpose for action? What's the purpose for link? And what's the purpose of this sentence? So the purpose for action is the children borrowed some laptops, and the agent is the children. The purpose for link is so, and the purpose of this statement is do homework at home, do work at home. So bear this in mind, especially about the purpose. Later we'll look a little bit at how this is used in analysis. And the second tools I used for the policy document is the legitimization strategies. Love the baby is very cute. There's 4 different legitimization strategies used for analysis in this study. One is, the first one is called authorization, and its linguistic manifestation is, for example, the expert said, I say if I'm the expert. So to create an authority, and basically legitimization strategy is to tell people we need to do this because da da da. And so the first one is obviously we need to do this because the authority says so. And the second one is a rationalization strategy, which shows we need to do certain things because it's been through a rationalization process. And the third one is saying we need to do this because it's morally good or it's a natural thing to do. And the last one is mythopoesis is sort of like painting a picture. So it leads you to think that's the natural progression of things. So these strategies are all used in the analysis of my document to see, to legitimize the intention, the purpose of the government. And another tool that I used for the policy and the interview is these 3 semantic tools. The first one is called nomination strategies. And the nomination strategy is used to construct an in-group, out-group relationship. So the othering strategy, so to speak. And predication strategy is used to identify qualities of things, and traditionally is used to identify social actors, but in my study, I also use it to identify qualities of other things, for example, language. And the intensify mitigation strategies is used to either intensify or mitigate the intensity of a speech, which then shows how the speakers feel about the topic. And it can be used, it can be realized in the use of vague expression, or things like, well, I think, oh, I feel, so they all have a mitigation element to it. In the analysis with the interview, I loaded the data into NVivo. And here is a diagram of how NVivo's code to theory practice happened in the analysis. And we don't have too much time left, but I just want to quickly perhaps go through the first 2 discourse very quickly as my findings. So the first discourse is a discourse on national identity, and that's from the policy. And we will use the word on national identity rather than of national identity, because we don't want discourse to fall into the ideology as a count noun. So we will, instead of saying the discourse of something, we will say the discourse on something. So we're observing the discourse that emerged. And the second discourse is discourse on hope, which is people's discourse. And if we have time in my presentation, we have another discourse on shared language ownership. So the discourse on national identity was done by comparing the two 6-year plan, stage 1 and stage 2, and I used the construction of purpose as the tools. So we've just done a little practice. As you can see, this is how we identify the government's intention, therefore the government's ideology, through that purposeful clause. And because this 2 plans has no English translation, so I had to use the Chinese character called ren, and I have to design, justify how ren can be used as an intentional marker. And because of the nature of this word, I had to do a transitivity analysis, which means this word contains a meaning of making something become something. And therefore, that's the intention of the government. So I compared the 2 policies, and also I look at the legitimization strategies that justify the intention. So here is a quick example with ren. I won't go into too much details, but in this example, as you can see, ren is sort of in the second line there. Ren plus indigenous language plus become the research headquarters for Austronesian language. So become the headquarter for Austronesian language, research headquarters for Austronesian language is the purposeful clause. Therefore, the purpose of this sentence, and therefore the intention of the government. From this sentence, we can see that the intention of the government isn't to save the language. Rather, it's to make Taiwan become a headquarter of research. And there's many other examples like this. So that is to say, the intention of the government is to establish Taiwan's international reputation. So therefore, this constitutes a discourse on national identity. And you can also see that the first clause, which is the purposeful action, is a nominalized action. So it's no actual social agents involved. So long story short, using this structure, we often find that the purposeful clause is it's not about revitalizing languages. It's more about establishing Taiwan's international reputation. Therefore, Taiwan as the national identity. And we also find that sometimes it may be about language, but when it's about language, the agent is not the government. So it often shows there's no human agencies as the active agents. So who is responsible for revitalizing Taiwan's indigenous language? Certainly not in the policy. We'll skip this one. And this is just another example of how construction of purpose is used in the official law. So this is an official law with the English translation. So I won't go into too much on this because I think we're running out of time. So I'll talk briefly about the discourse of people. There are 4 themes on the discourse of hope, and that's the voice of people. I want to focus on the last one, which is linguistic Stockholm syndrome here. So all of these things shows that, there is still a hope for language revitalization. So linguistic Stockholm syndrome shows a lot of similarities with the actual Stockholm syndrome. So the formal definitions of Stockholm syndrome is that number 1, the victim develops positive feelings towards the captor. Number 2, they develop sympathies for their captor's causes or goals. And number 3, they develop negative feelings towards the help. Similarly, with the participants' linguistic behavior towards the government, so government is the colonial government that oppressed their language, they develop gratitude towards the dominant power. They sympathize towards the government's obstacles in language revitalization efforts. And then they develop negative feelings towards remedial actions for language revitalization. So here are some examples of what they said. So when I asked the participants, they would say, oh, I feel the government is making an effort. Oh, it's great. So they're very grateful for simple, small acts that the government has done towards their language. And they're very sympathetic towards the government's obstacle because we haven't seen any results. And so they would justify for the government by saying, oh, but these results takes time. I feel they're doing well, but it takes time. So they're kind of justifying for the government. And the last one is a longer quote. So I couldn't put the whole quote in it, but I'll read it to you. So with a Stockholm syndrome, they start developing sort of a negative feeling towards the help about language revitalization. So one of the participants would say things like, oh, we have the language classes. I want my daughter to go, but if she goes to the language classes, she will miss out on her exam or her study time or da. So then she didn't want the daughter to go to the language class. So this is how I draw the metaphor of Stockholm syndrome and my study together. And the linguistic Stockholm syndrome, like Stockholm syndrome, it highlights an oppressed supporting the oppressor. It highlights the power imbalance. It highlights the hegemonic discourse and its impact on impact and the impact of colonization on indigenous people, rendering them kind of helpless. But Stockholm syndrome is also a defense mechanism. It provides hope in a hopeless situation for the victims. So I feel that my participants is using this as a survival mechanism for their language. They're hopeful that the government will save their language. So what does this all mean? The policy discourse and the participants discourse. While the policy suggests that Taiwan is using indigenous languages as a bargaining chip to differentiate Taiwan from China, indigenous participants felt if they agree or bought into or on the government side, the government will continue to support their language revitalization. And therefore, while they have addressed that, the government hasn't done enough, or that they are actually quite aggrieved about the process of colonization, they are still hopeful that the current government and the policy will go in the right direction to help them with their language. So that's the end of the presentation. Thank you. Questions?